All right, I'd like to gavel in the Public Safety Committee meeting. It is December 6th. It is shortly after 11 o'clock. And we have a full agenda. So if I could start with introductions. Ms. LaFrance.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Christopher Constant.
Eric Croft.
Dig Training. Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson.
Amy DeBoski.
Tim Steele.
Sean Casey.
Justin Dolly.
Seneca Pino, State Prosecutors.
And we'll probably stop it there. Sometimes we introduce the whole room, but we'll just do it at the head table. We're pleased, honored to have Presiding Judge Morris of the 3rd Judicial District here at our invitation. Thank you for coming, sir. And being mindful of his time, I thought we'd start with him, though we also have crime update from our APD Chief Dahl, and a shorter reports, I think, on the relatively quickly on community work service and on Nextdoor and how it can be used in public safety. But again, mindful of your time and the importance of this issue, did you want to introduce us? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but did you want to introduce us to the concepts of the bail schedule, where it comes from? That would be great. Then thank you, Judge Morris.
Again, my name is Bill Morris. I'm a Superior Court judge. I'm also one of the 4 presiding judges in the state. The state has 4 judicial districts. The 3rd is from the chain up Anchorage, Prince William Sound, Palmer, Kenai Peninsula. I'm one of the drafters of the current bail schedule. I've given you a packet that includes criminal rules that authorize the bail schedule, the state statutes that lay out the current criteria for bail that judicial officers should use, and a modification to the bail schedule that will probably be issued later today or tomorrow. Although just before I came here, one of the other presiding judges sent me an email saying he wanted to tweak some language. I'm not sure precisely what. So what you've got here is an unsigned version. It may be slightly different than the signed one that comes out later today or tomorrow. The Supreme Court has issued criminal rules that authorize bail schedules. There's a bunch of bail schedules of traffic and fish and game that I won't talk about. And they authorize a misdemeanor bail schedule, not a felony bail schedule. There are no bail schedules for felonies. It used to be that there was a bunch of localized bail schedules. Each court location sort of came up with one that was, could be a couple pages long, could be 20, a whole host of things developed over time. And the presiding judges a couple years ago said, well, wait a minute, this is probably not that rational. There's a single set of state statutes to which this applies. There's a single criteria of bail decisions, or bail criteria. So why not make a single bail schedule that applies statewide? So we did that. We revised it over time as a variety of things happened. We revised it after SB 91, dealing with the changes they made to a couple of crimes that were no longer crimes, but were instead citable but not jailable offenses. It didn't make any sense to us that you could be held in jail on bail for a crime that you can't be jailed on. So we made some changes to that. The legislature then revised just recently several things, changing a couple of those citations back to modest crimes with a very short jail sentence, but jail sentences nonetheless. So we modified our bail schedule accordingly. The one that has probably caused the most dispute amongst the presiding judges and caused some heartburn amongst a number of folks around the state was the provision we put in there where we declined to put a requirement that said that if you are, once you are jailed, you can only be released if you are sober, however you define that. A couple of the presiding judges thought that was perfectly appropriate. 2 of us said, no, that's not appropriate. I was one of the ones who said it was not appropriate. My thinking is that I knew of no authority that said that if you simply have a beer on board, you can't walk down the street. It's not illegal to have liquor in your system. And so I did not understand why I could keep a person in jail until he or she was completely free of alcohol or below a particular defined level. The legislature recently changed that, They said that the Department of Corrections shall not release somebody unless you're below 0.08. So at least my legal concern has been addressed. One of the other practical matters is that some of the presiding judges or some of the local bail schedules did include that provision. It was particularly important to the judges in the northern parts of the state where you have a guy that's intoxicated, you don't want to let him out until it's 40 below zero, and you find him frozen in the snowbank. But there were practical considerations as well. If the definition is sober, explain to me how a jail official is supposed to do that. That a lot of the jail officials were unwilling to make that subjective judgment. Some of them were quite willing. We got pushback from some jail facilities that said, I don't want to take on that responsibility. Some of them said, some of the jail schedules said, okay, below a point, 10, 0.08, whatever. That means typically you're going to have a PBT or some sort of testing mechanism. So some of the jails said, explain to me who's going to pay for this. Why am I, so corrections going to have to give what? One every hour, one every 3 hours, whatever it is, to generate, and that's a cost consideration. So some of the local facilities were not willing to do that. But nonetheless, that's changed now. The legislature has spoken, and that condition is in place, and the new bail schedule includes that provision. I have spoken to police officers in the district and talked to them about it. And one of the common things that I get is, wait a minute, we've got a guy that is being disruptive, is being obnoxious, and you turn around and let him out. And I always try to point out to people two things. One, bail is not penalty. Bail is not punishment. I'm not supposed to be penalizing somebody by keeping him in jail, even though they engage in so obnoxious behavior. What I'm supposed to do is decide whether or not this person is a flight risk, meaning more realistically, will he or she show up to court? It's not really they're going to fly to the Dominican Republic. Are they going to show up? And are they a public safety risk? That's the more important consideration. Now, one thing I want you to understand about a bail schedule, it's only in place for a short period of time, from the time of arrest until the time you're in front of a judicial officer. And after that, the judicial officer, at the request of the defense, at the request of the prosecutor, can modify the conditions of bail. It's a temporary thing, and one of the administrative logistical advantages of it is that the police officer is not, the alternative is the police officer takes to a committing magistrate, telephonic or in person, and that officer is now sitting in a courtroom for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a half hour or 2 hours, whatever it is, not on the street. So one of the advantages of a bail schedule is you get the bail set, the officer takes the person to the jail facility, jail is automatically set, the officer hands it over to the jail folks and heads back out to do what police officers do on the street. So, that's one of the goals. There are provisions in the bail schedule that allow the officer, if he thinks that there's some reason in this particular case to deviate from the schedule, to get a hold of the magistrate. If there are particular circumstances that you would normally say to the judicial officer, here's why it should be more higher bail, more conditions, whatever, officer's free to do that. Likewise, the defendant is free to contact the judicial officer and say, modify as well. So the bail schedule shows that. Now, so in Anchorage, after hours, there's a committing magistrate at the courthouse where the officers can either show up in person, do it telephonically. We have expanded those committing magistrate authority or responsibility to not quite statewide, but there are typically what was happening in other locations is that some number of judges, magistrates, deputy, courts of clerk, deputized to do this would rotate through the evening and on weekends to deal with an arrest situation or bail situation. And so we said, well, let's not do that. Let's let the Anchorage folks deal with that because they're sitting there anyway. So they have after-hours responsibilities far broader than just Anchorage. They also have responsibility from 4:30 until about 9 o'clock to deal with some other emergency things, API commitments, and domestic violence petitions. So, I mention that because sometimes police officers who come in either in person or by telephone to do an arrest warrant, to do a bail thing or occasionally search warrants, have to appreciate that there may well be something going on in the courtroom with somebody who's, seeking a domestic violence petition. So that takes place. I think we shut the door at 9 p.m. But if you're in there, the hearing continues until it's completed. We also have weekends during the day, procedures for domestic violence as well. So sometimes there's a delay that's frustrating, understandably, to police officers when they can't get in the door as quickly as they would like. And sometimes they have to stand in line because of not only domestic violence matters, but other police applications locally and from around the state. The bail schedule that you see includes an articulation of provisions, what we call user notes, which we presiding judges wanted to sort of document the history of what they're doing and their thought process, so that not only we can understand what we did when we had to revise something, but that other people who read it have some better understanding of why we're doing something. And it also included a cheat sheet, if you will. Our thought was that we would have essentially a shrunken down single document that a police officer could have in the car to, as a quick reference point. Whether they use it or not, it's up to them. But that's the structure of it.
That's the appendix, the statewide bail summary.
What do we call it? Yes, appendix A. It's just a short version, so you're not carrying a 10-page document. I'm perfectly willing to answer any questions. That I'll try to answer your questions later.
This is, I do very much appreciate you being here. I sent, the handout is the older bail schedule. He's handed for us out the newer proposed bail schedule, so you have both as well. Judge Morris has copied for us. I appreciated the court rules on establishing a misdemeanor bail schedule and the state statute providing some of the statutory framework for.
Let me just make one brief point about that statutory. If you turn to the second page of that packet I gave you, it starts out with the presumption that there's an OR release.
Is that new from 91 or was that old law?
No, that's been there forever. Long time, pre-91, pre-SB 91. That people sort of forget that. That's what the legislature is telling judicial officers. There's the starting point. And then it drops down to when you deviate from that OR release based on a variety of considerations. And it said, assure the appearance of the person and the danger. And then once you determine those things, you still have to use the least restrictive conditions. That's the guidelines. And then the next page, C, there's a variety of factors that we have to look at. If you look at those factors, those are something that if you were to start afresh, you'd probably include, for straight, your connection to the community, your prior record. That's sort of what you're talking about. The community connection affects the probability that you're going to appear, and your past history has some input onto whether you're likely to be dangerous in the next 24 to 36 hours. Wow. The bail provision, the bail ultimately set by the judicial officer stays in place until the case is, disposed of. The bail schedule is much shorter, narrower time frame.
Is this the first time we've had a statewide bail schedule as opposed to districts or communities?
To my knowledge, yes.
And
A statewide misdemeanor one. There is a statewide traffic, a statewide fish and game. That's in court rules adopted by the Supreme Court.
And as I said, so one of the handouts is the older bail schedule. He's given us the new one as well as the statutory and rule basis for him. I also sent him, I meant to get it to you earlier, Judge Morris, but anyway, I sent on Monday, I believe, some questions that I had, questions from the committee as well. I'll start with a couple of mine and then put people on the list. Let the record reflect that Assembly Person Weddleton has joined us.
So that's Rivera.
It came in just afterwards. Yeah, Mr. Rivera as well.
Gotta keep him straight.
Never any respect, is there, Felix?
It's not respect. He came in a bit earlier. Any other picky corrections? So the rules talk about each judicial district doing it, and they seem to imply that you might have schedules for particular communities. Why is
There's no
it?
question that we could do that.
Why is it appropriate to have a statewide? So just thinking about it, you could come to the conclusion that Anchorage had sort of a different situation than Queethluck or Dutch Harbor, and they should each have their own bail schedules. Why did you feel that was appropriate?
We thought that there was a set of state crimes that applies statewide. There is a bail statute that applies statewide. It doesn't make much sense to me, well, it makes more sense to me that somebody who does a certain act that results in his arrest for a suspected theft or suspected assault in the fourth degree in Anchorage is treated the exact same behavior in Palmer or Kenai or somewhere else in the state. I don't dispute that there are local environmental conditions that may play in, but again, the bail schedule is the default schedule, and if there is something that the arresting officer thinks warrants deviation, call the judicial officer. But that's the starting point.
And so a related sort of very general theoretical question, why does it make sense to have categories of crime that have a tremendous variation in their factual situation? Assault, non-DV assault, can be anything from pushing somebody to really much more egregious stuff. Why does it make sense to have them all be 500 in the one I saw?
Well, the alternative is that you, within a particular category, assault 4, somehow lay out a whole set of, an assault that was, back up. Assaults are defined in the statute to be committed in a variety of ways. You can commit an assault with words, you can commit it with threats, you can do,
Right.
don't quote me, there's a variety of ways of doing that. The legislature has said all of that different behavior is all categorically equivalent in terms of seriousness. So they've already made this determination of a variety of behavior is essentially equivalent. So that's sort of our starting point. So why we decided that various different types of crimes are treated similarly is largely because the legislature has told us that those things, those misdemeanors, are Class B misdemeanors, less than 10 days incarceration possible, or all Class A misdemeanors. So they've told us that these things are essentially equivalent in the sense that they're within this range. And so, you can quibble over whether it should be $500 or $250, but the treatment of Class A misdemeanors largely the same as what we're trying to do. The ones that are more, inherently violent, we tried to treat a little more seriously. The statute restricts domestic violence. It imposes a mandatory no bail until you're in front of a judicial officer. So that's the differentiation there. That's a legislative phenomenon for us. That's we took the categorization that the legislature gave us and tried to be relatively true to it, while anticipating the likely kinds of behavior and the application of the legislative lesson criteria.
Those
And
categorizations.
again, you can always ask the judicial officer to deviate.
Yeah, and, those categorizations give range of penalties. Sort of, they don't really set at you shall do 30 days unless you decide to up to 6 months or down to 0. They just say 0 to 6 months.
The vast majority of misdemeanors is 0 to 1 year.
Right.
DWI is 72 hours. There's a couple other driving offenses that have phased different mandatory or ranges.
So, how should we understand, if this is just a starting point and there is a tremendous ability to go before a judicial officer and say, this should be a 2001 because look at what they did, or this should be 250 or nothing at all because of look at what they did. It's one thing. So sort of how sticky or binding is the bail schedule? Is it something?
With the exception of, there are certain mandatory things that tie our hands, we have to follow. DVs are not bailable until you're in front of a judicial officer. But once you're in front of a judicial officer, the rest of those components can be changed. Up the monetary bail, add additional conditions, remove some conditions, based on the circumstances.
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to understand. They can be, and is it we stick to this unless you prove overwhelmingly? I mean, how binding or sticky are these?
Once you walk into the courtroom, you're essentially at ground zero, with the caveat that you realize that there's been the bail set by the schedule. But there's no presumption. There's no. It's just a typical. It's like any other arraignment / bail hearing. Somebody comes in and says, "I think it should be higher. I think it should be lower." Judge, weigh everything, change it.
Okay, I have a couple people in line. I had some just very general questions, and then I had a list of specific. I'll just finish the general and then go through the people that had questions. I had Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Constant, and Mr. Peterson. Anyone else on the list? Then let me just finish on the more general. So I had a question on the release sober, but the legislature changed that, and this new bail schedule changes it. So I really don't have to talk about those.
And to be, it mandates that corrections should hold this person until you're below .08.
So now you've reflected in the new bail schedule that
Correct.
you've got to release.
Mr. Cross?
Yeah.
Judge, if I may, the language as I read it says that the program of corrections shall conduct a chemical test of their breath, but that they may hold them until release. How do you?
Let me. My read of the statute, if my recollection is right, is that it's mandatory.
So we're looking at page 4 of 10 on your new
Paragraph
proposed.
8, and it's the 4 lines down where it says may detain. Let me look at that, because this is intended to follow the statute. If that may language is inappropriate, it should be shall. I'll change it. I will track the statute. That's probably an oversight unless somehow there's some discretion. My recollection is
I believe the statute is may as well.
it does say may.
I believe it says
I
may.
mean, I'm going to track the statute in paragraph 8.
Okay. So assuming that it says may, how can you offer an interpretation of what that might look
No.
like? Okay.
Okay, so you guys are going faster and more familiar with it, but we're on page 3 of 10 on the proposed new bail schedule, paragraph 8, and it's the third from the bottom line, may release the defendant to another person, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it says
Is there
may,
another- may detain even
the sentence
above
goes,
it.
the correctional facility may detain and then may release. I mean, there's two things. If somebody's intoxicated and they don't have a body to be released to, they have to get below the level, and then you can walk out the door, assuming you meet whatever other criteria. And if I believe it also allows, however, if a responsible person shows up and says, "I'll take my kid home," you can release the person even though that person is still over the limit. That's presumably the responsible person. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of discretion there in corrections. Someone's going to decide whether this person who shows up is a responsible person, but that's to be worked out.
Right. And then The other thing that stood out to me, and then I'll let it go through the other people, other assembly members that had questions.
Let me, one other, this paragraph 8 takes effect January 1, because that's when the statute takes effect.
Why, if the legislature has established 3 days for a first drunk driving, is there no presumption of bail? That is
Because there is a presumption, it's a presumption of innocence.
well, we set for a second DUI of 500 and a third 1,000. Why is it appropriate to have zero bail on a first DUI?
Because I can't give that guy his time back if he's not convicted.
Well,
Basically, that's the basic answer.
but the same's true of subsequent DUIs.
True, but you get to, you typically get to a judicial officer quickly enough where the higher mandatory minimum doesn't really come into play. I mean, I'm gonna have a problem if you say to me, the mandatory minimum is 3 days, serve your 3 days, and we'll decide whether you're innocent or you're guilty later.
Well, the legislature has determined that that's the minimum for the crime. I'm not talking about having them serve it, but why for a crime that, if convicted, it should be a minimum of 3 days, is zero the default on bail?
Because the bail statute says the presumption is you're released OR. And assuming that you're a first-time offender, that's probably less serious than the guy with the second or third or fourth in terms of danger to the public. You know, you're making the assumption that the first-time guy, there but for the grace of God go many of us, and the second one is, you know, if you haven't learned, I mean,
Well, we don't know if they're guilty on the second one either.
no, we don't.
Um,
But we know he's been convicted previously and has been arrested a second time, so in terms of weighing dangerousness, it's a little bit higher.
All right, those were, as I said, the general questions. I do have some others, but Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Croft. That actually, the point just made brings another interesting point. Because it seems to imply that they're going to sit there for at least 3 days before they actually get to one of these hearings.
Typically, you're going to get, if you get arrested tonight, you're going to be in a courtroom tomorrow.
Right.
Morning.
And I have very limited experience with bail hearings. I've worked on a handful. I'm sure you've probably done hundreds.
I've done a couple of your bail hearings.
So, but I still have some. It was years and years ago. So I still have some general questions. I want you. Hope you could refresh. So, you said to Mr. Croft that you can make recommendations to go up or down, and it sort of implied to me that this isn't binding. Is that right? And if it's not binding, then why is it here?
It's a default. It is a pre-judicial determination by the presiding judges for what should be in place until a judicial officer looks at that specific case.
But a judicial officer is going to look at every case.
Right. There'll be a delay.
Right, okay. And so, okay, I think I understand that. The second question I have, and it is another one of these broader questions, we heard a lot during our discussion about SB 91 and everything else about C felonies. That was a big point of contention. And we had some reports from the public, or from law enforcement, you bring in on a C felony and then they're out almost immediately. But here on page 1, it says in both versions, the proposed and the old one. Let me double check on the proposed. Yeah, it says the bail schedule does not apply to felonies.
Correct.
So what does happen with a C felony? Is there a case where you get arrested on a C felony and then you're out on the street an hour later?
The judge makes a decision either at night or at the next hearing.
Okay. So are there sets of circumstances where someone could get arrested on a C felony and then almost immediately be back out on the street with a minimal bail?
It would all depend on the timing of the arrest in comparison to when the next arraignment happened, and they happen every day.
Right.
And in the morning, I can't remember, the municipal cases are maybe in the morning and the states in the afternoon. I don't quote me.
Cities at 1 and states at 2:30.
So at any rate, that's when, depending on, anybody that gets arrested up to some cutoff point right before, I don't know, sometime, is going to be in front of a judicial officer at the jail court the next day of arrest. And let's say you got arrested 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, where the regular courthouse is closed down. You can be taken by an officer to the committing magistrate, who's open 24 hours, and she could issue a bail order.
Okay, but
Increasing, decreasing, deviating from the default bail schedule.
but I thought there wasn't a default bail schedule for felonies.
You were asking felonies, so there is no bail schedule applicable to felonies. I forgot to be talking about felonies.
Okay,
So that's going to, that person will sit in jail without any bail until a judicial officer sets the bail.
and then that bail is set, variety of factors, danger to the public,
Same
statute, but not on a
criteria.
default schedule.
It's not on the bail schedule, it's not on the default schedule, but the criteria, if you look at my packet of page 3, well, in page 2, you start with the default of OR and the general criteria, assure the appearance of the person,
Yeah.
will he pose a danger, impose the least restrictive condition, and then C on page 3 is a list of criteria that we weigh. And as a practical matter, what usually happens in a bail hearing is the first thing you say, what's the guy's prior record? How long you lived here? The guy's been here 30 years, got a job, got kids, probably going to show up to court. Well, certainly not going to leave the state. And then you want to know the prior record, and you want to know how recent those prior records are. The guy's 50 years old, and he had a disorderly conduct when he was 18. I don't really care about that. If, on the other hand, he's got 3 pending felonies, I got a problem. He's got a problem.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Judge. This has been a conversation among attorneys. And so my conversation or my question isn't kind of...
That doesn't mean it was a more elevated.
No, I agree with you. It's at a level that is not very practical for me. 2 things, the previous discussion on the release for alcohol, what doesn't seem to be contemplated here is the medical clearance. A lot of the people that kind of circulate in my neighborhood actually walk around with a 0.2 alcohol level. 0.08 being the legal level, and if they got to 0.08 from 0.2, they would be very sick and dying. And so I don't know what that means.
Let me give you. The police have the authority for people who are at the extreme end to under Title 47 to bring them in and for their own sort of medical safety. And when the police bring folks to the jail will at some point say, I'm going to take that person because that person is too intoxicated and I think there's some medical threat, and they go to the emergency room. And then there's a category of people that, I don't know, everybody's a little bit different, but, whether they're not thinking straight, that's a different set of conditions. And just be careful about 0.08. 0.08 is, it's not illegal to be drunk walking down the street. It's illegal to be in a car, 0.08. 0.08 is only a car phenomenon with the exception of now this, jail release phenomenon. So.
I understand. People die at 0.08 if they started at 0.2. So, okay, but really the question that kind of building on what Mr. Dunbar said, this conversation for me peaked around the conversation about SB 91 and the challenges that law enforcement states that they experienced, that there was a phenomenon where because of the rules under SB 91, and we kind of got to the question, is it the bail schedule or SB 91? It's pretty hard to tell, that there wasn't much room for determination by the judge, that in fact, practically speaking, is a pretty clean line that if a person comes in, they're gonna get released at that line. And so, I just wanna be clear, I'm hearing you say that the officers can, in fact, request a higher standard and expect at some level that that might happen.
They can ask. And my guess is the judicial officer will respond to, if he or she finds it convincing what the officer says, both that it's true and that, the circumstances warrant deviation, yes, they'll do that.
And from your experience, does that really happen?
Yes. Judges are hardwired to be case-by-case people. Just as an oversimplification, that's what we do, day in and day out. What are the weird particularities of this situation? We chafe at legislatures who tell us that one size fits all. You get to do that, that's fine. You guys are more apt to, as a general oversimplification, err on this side of one size fits all. And in the criminal world, it sort of, over time, always moves in one direction.
Thank you.
But, your concern about SB 91 and its impact and its relationship with the bail schedule. The bail schedule pre-existed SB 91. It was changed only to reflect those two things that got turned into citations. I don't think there was any change to the bail schedule other than that as a result of SB 91. I might be wrong, but those are the two main ones. And they did cause a lot of logistical problems about, what do you do with this guy that you can't jail but can arrest? Odd thing, and that got modified. The concern of the public about the impact of SB 91 is probably vastly uninformed.
I definitely don't disagree. One last quick follow-up. When was the original bail schedule unified? Not created, but unified across the board in the judicial
The
district?
first statewide bail schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years ago. I can get you that specific date, but roughly 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, and just as a matter of theory then, the crime stats started to jump at a time before SB 91 was implemented. And so that definitely raises a question of correlation versus causation for me.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so what I seem to be gathering from what we've covered here is the judicial officers actually have an ability to set conditions that are unique for every individual case. And so we can put standard default language in here, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to follow that, because you're going to look at each individual case and try to set the situation up to make sure that that person shows up for court.
Correct.
When you set the conditions.
With the understanding that we're focused on the two things the legislature told us to focus on: the probability of appearance in court and dangerousness during the period of release. So, yes, the judge can do a lot of things, but it's not likely that you're going to suddenly say you got to wear green pants. It's going to be focused to those things, and there's a handful of things that you do to make sure that the person appears. You post a bond, appearance bond, which you will lose if you don't show up to court, and a performance bond, which says do X, Y. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, or if you violate some prohibition, then you lose money. And then there's the other large, larger questions that are beyond the judicial officer's capacity, which is how much do you want to spend to keep somebody in jail? What's the impact, pre-trial? What's the impact on that person's ability to function? Jail isn't a neutral place.
Right.
And there's a lot of thought about the negative impact on people. If you disrupt somebody, when you lose a job, lose a car, lose your house, you spiral it down. That's one problem. And those things are sort of beyond what, those are more the legislature's determination of factors, and now this new bail statute, or that SB 91's creation of the new bail thing, that's starting January 1st. But the bail schedule will remain in place, because again, it's the default phenomenon until the judge makes a decision now with this new information that the bail algorithm is going to provide to the judicial officer. And there'll be a different option, which used to be a third-party custodian, which is, your uncle, your brother, your neighbor is going to sit with you. Now, for some segment of people, there will be for lack of a better word, a pretrial probation officer who will provide that role. But again, the bail statute is trying you don't want to pay for a probation officer to watch my mother to see whether or not she's going to, violate conditions of bail, because my mother isn't going to violate, she's a low-risk person. And there's you want to reserve that resource for people who ought to be out of jail if they have supervision. So, that's what you'll see, this new bail algorithm try and parse out. Who gets released OR? And some of that is mandatory. Some of that is not. Judges do not have discretion. And then some people are going to be very far in, and it will stay in.
Great. Thank you.
I think my mom will be medium at least, but I was just
Amy's
trying to categorize her. Yeah,
Amy's trying to get you.
yeah, she's got it. Ms. Thino, can you give us an idea of how many misdemeanants that you supervise are whose their bail is set by the bail schedule or by an individual determination? Is it 50-50, 90-10, or do you unable to do that sort of on the fly?
I would say APD may be able to give a better number, but my guess would be that the vast majority are being set by bail schedule.
Is that your impression, Chief?
I think so.
I think that's absolutely right. Understanding that it's from the short period of time from arrest until you're in front of a judicial officer. Whether that's 8 hours or 24 or 36. Some people, I can tell you, I do jail court arraignments occasionally, and sometimes you'll have people that are too intoxicated to come to the court. So instead of a 24-hour, 8-hour, that you add another 24 hours to it. But if the guy is functional, comes in, the judicial officer is going to set that. So the bail schedule deals with the people from arrest until judicial officer. Thereafter, it's a judge's decision.
Like 3 out of 4, like vast majority, like 90-10, or just that's hard to say?
Bail schedule versus bail hearing.
Yeah.
Well, remember, you got to throw in there that we have people that are OR released or site released, and the vast majority of our folks are actually OR released or site released.
Well, that's what the bail schedule says. You mean pursuant to the bail schedule, they're OR. Yeah, so, your summary sheet, but also the bail schedule says defendants arrested for misdemeanors that aren't listed above are released OR. So counting those, it's the vast majority? Amy, just 1 second, and then one other, and I got you on the list. In the way that the old and the new describe how you deviate from it, it's paragraph 9 of both. Officer or defendant request for monetary bail, bail modification, or additional conditions. There's two paragraphs. One, if the arresting officer applying, and the other at the defendant's request. And the defendant's request one is longer and sort of sets this: if you may modify if you find these things and in this order. There isn't a similar one for I guess the analogy there would be, and if the judicial officer finds that they are a threat or they might be, then you should do, or should, may, can do these things.
The language on the defendant request side comes right out of the criminal rule.
Yeah.
And I think this June one that you have might have been the first time we included that, the defendant request. In the earlier ones, we frankly just overlooked it. As a practical matter, in talking to the committee magistrates, it rarely happens that defendants request a bail hearing in the middle of the night before their actual arraignment later, the next day. But we realize that's a mandatory component, a mandatory option that the rule set. So we included it in the order. Our experience has been that the officers are not. The officers know what to say when they want to increase conditions. They've got something happened on the street, and they're going to tell the judge about it. It's not. In my experience, I'm not hearing any magistrates saying officers came in and say, "I want to change a bail, but I don't know why." That's not what happens. Officers know full well what they want and why they want it. Whether the judicial officer buys that reasoning is a different question, but usually officers just had a run-in with this person. Usually what means is they think that he's belligerent, obnoxious, likely to return to the scene of the crime, or is going to return to somebody and punch him. They want to cool him down. And that's another phenomenon. Lots of times people's level of dangerousness changes over time. If you're a career criminal, that's one thing. But if you're a hothead or under the influence of whatever, or are mad at your girlfriend, you usually calm down. Not everybody, but usually. And so that's often why you'll see bail changes over time, whether it's 28 hours, 24 hours, or 3 weeks later.
And can a particularly dangerous offender get a requirement of a third-party custodian?
Currently, yes. The use of third-party custodians, the private third-party custodian, is going to change dramatically with the new bail world. And
That was my understanding, but I didn't know how.
I don't think if private third-party custodians are allowed, and they may be completely barred, if they are allowed, they aren't going to be used very much because the Department of Correction supervising bail probation officer, whatever they're called, will likely be the person who provides that function. And the Department of Corrections has got a variety of things they're going to be doing. They're going to have a variety of ankle monitors that have GPS components to them, so that they can tell if you are somewhere, so that there can be exclusion zones, there can be inclusion.
Private third party, you mean electronic monitoring services?
That's one part.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one aspect. There's currently electronic monitoring that is being done as a condition of bail, and also as an alternative to incarceration.
Right.
Post-sentencing. The pretrial electronic monitoring is going to be part of the Department of Corrections. There's going to be, they will, this is all new, so, giant caveat here, I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work. But I've been shown by the corrections folks, a variety of these GPS monitors that they're going to be having. So you can keep a person in a house and tell if they've left the house.
Right.
You can keep them away from some place, so if they get close, you can tell. And there will also be a probation officer who may do some level of, you call me, or you have to come in and I can see you, or I go see you.
Ms. Domboski, thank you, sir.
No, Judge Morris, thank you so much for being here. This is a great experience for me to learn more. And you actually were touching on one of my questions, was how was third-party custodians going to change? So he was actually answering my question. The second part, I don't really know if you'll be able to answer because it's a lot of anecdotal information. But, I've been reached out to by probation officers that have expressed frustration. And part of it was, I remember one probation officer coming to me saying, listen, this particular guy, I can't give you the details, but he's a really bad guy. He's violated his conditions of release 4 times. We go in and the judge just lets him out. Now, of course, this goes case by case basis, and I guess what I'm hearing you say is it really depends on the case and the conditions and the person and the level of threat. I mean, do you have any
Well,
general comments on that situation?
Let me provide a little context. People convicted of misdemeanors don't have probation officers. They may be on probation, they don't have probation officers. People who have felony convictions will have probation officers. And the probation officer, the sentence includes a host of general conditions and specific conditions. And they're all supposed to be reflective of the individual's crime and dangerousness. So you can't just slap on no drinking in a case that's got absolutely nothing to do with alcohol or anyway. So, but some of those conditions are like, obviously commit no crimes. That's one thing. There's also report a change of address in advance or within 24 hours or something like that. So, if you've got a guy that's been on probation for a long time, he's doing really well, and he changed apartments from one block to another or even across town, probation officers don't care. They're not going to file a petition for probation. I don't doubt that there have been situations where people have committed violations of probation and have been let out relatively quickly. There's probably a good reason for that. Judges don't do this willy-nilly.
Right.
And I can tell you, I run what's called a PACE court, which is based on a Hawaii model. The problem they were trying to solve is typically probation officers have discretion. And they would often say, okay, this guy didn't show up at his meeting when he should have, but he's otherwise been doing okay, so let it slide. He doesn't show up a second time, warns him, yelled at him. And eventually 6 or 7 of these pile up, and then the PO says enough is enough, files a petition to revoke probation. But there's 6 violations over the course of 12 months, so the person is entitled to a hearing. Now that hearing is more complicated because there's a variety of things, witnesses are gone, You have eventually he's found guilty of 2, 3, 4, you impose a new sentence. The sentence has been imposed now 16 months after the first conduct. If you're a parent and you yell at your kids for violating curfew only 6 months after it happened, not much of an impact. So the Hawaii judge said in 3 circumstances the PO no longer has discretion. You must arrest. If you don't show up to a meeting that I tell you to show up to, if you don't show up to a drug or alcohol testing, or if you test positive for something you're not supposed to have, you must arrest him or you must get an arrest warrant. So we did this. We went to Hawaii, came back, we implemented it. I think we were the second or third location to do this nationwide, and it's growing. So we also speed things up. So if the PO wants an arrest warrant, they come to me. They come up to me a couple times a day. I sign the arrest warrant, and most arrest warrants get put into the arrest warrant pile. And when the guy runs a red light, you go, "Oh, I got an arrest warrant now from 6 months ago." We have an arrangement with APD where for our PACE guys, they go looking for it. The first one I issued, we were still setting up. We were hoping, the machinery was all in place. I figured I probably got a couple days before this guy shows up. He was arrested in 4 hours. Now that's not happening all the time, but APD affirmatively goes out and looks for these folks. Then when they come back in, we process them really quickly. And the other thing is that the penalties are modest. Day, 2 days, 3 days. If they repeat, it goes up. If they go on a run, they just disappear. They get 30 days. What they discovered in Hawaii, and they did a control group, old system, new system. They had a 50% reduction in substance abuse, and a 50% reduction in the amount of time these guys spent in jail. So there's a category of people who you can kind of coerce into sobriety. We also discover more quickly that this is a person who's got a bigger problem. and who needs real treatment. You know, we discover those people more quickly, and we also get them, you know, when they relapse, we catch them quicker and deal with them more quickly. So they've been doing heroin for 2 days or meth for 3 days instead of, you know, 2 or 3 months when they spiraled into oblivion. And if we need treatment and more formal treatment, we get them in more quickly. So they come in front of me, and you know, I deal with them quickly. I if they're going to do 2, 3, 4, 5 days, but they've got a real job, I make them spend time, you know, on their weekend. I don't want them losing a job. I don't want them losing structure and income and, you know, responsibility. That's not. We did a control group when we first started it. We had some problems with the data collection, so it's not really a, you know, a defensible study. But it looks like we also had that. So to get back to your concern about probation conditions, at least with the guys that I've got, and I've got 200 of them. You know, I bring them in, they get caught in, and we also tell them, you know, you're grown-ups, we know you're going to screw up occasionally, but if you're responsible and take responsibility, we're going to treat you less severely. So if you go to the PO and say, I got to give you a urine sample and I smoked a joint yesterday, I'm going to be positive. You're still getting arrested, but you're getting a lesser sentence than if you said it's clean, 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 and then, you know, there's a whole host of drugs in there. If you oversleep or you miss the PO thing and you call up and say, I'll be in 2 hours, I'll be in tomorrow, and you do that, you're still going to get arrested, but you will get less time than if you figure, you know, a lot of these guys go, I'm going to go to jail, so I might as well party. Or I might as well do something, I better work for a couple of days to get some money to pay my next month's rent. You know, that's sort of a more responsibly and still goofy thing. So we try and tell them, please, get in here quickly, take responsibility, we'll lessen your penalty. And what the other judge did, I'll shut up here, he did it alone in Hawaii for a while, then he gave it to 10 other judges, and they tracked the disparity of the amount of jail time that they gave to a certain conduct. And, you know, over the course of the 10 judges, there was some good judges did 1 day, and the other judges did 2, 3, 5, 10. It didn't have any impact. The amount of jail time for most of these folks didn't matter. It was the rapidity of the response that mattered. Getting the guy in and saying, you know, bad decision, making them realize they made a decision. A lot of these guys don't realize that they make decisions. Things just happen to them. And you have to explain to them, no. When you saw your buddy who you knew was probably holding heroin and you went up to him and say, hey, how's it going? You were making the decision to you. And when the person came to your door unexpected and you let him in and then he pulled it out, I mean, the decision is happening. So you have to talk to these folks and say, and you know, it takes them a while to, many of these folks have an event horizon of about a minute and can't connect conduct with consequences. So that's what we're trying to do in this situation, is shrink the court system's response time so that we can educate folks and hopefully make them better decisions. We also tell them, look, I'm not interested in keeping you on probation if you do well. I'll take you off probation sooner. I mean, that's an incentive we give you. I'm not interested in having a probation officer spend time with my mom who's doing great. I want the probation officer dealing with people who are dangerous, that need supervision. So at any rate, that's a long.
Just the discussion I wanted, but we're running out of time and have the APD report. Was that all you had? Yeah, Mr. Constant.
Thanks. Yeah, you really hit on something pretty darn enlightened there. That treatment motivation isn't actually what people think it is. That when you hear people in the public say, well, they aren't going to get sober unless they really want it, in fact, isn't the case. I work as a treatment provider, and the experience we have is that court-motivated people actually perform just as well through the treatment process as people who've had a moment of clarity and decide they need this for themselves. And so you're right on the money there, I believe. A question I've had and heard a lot about in the community is that the ASAP program and other pre-sentencing treatment options have been taken off the table. Is that your experience?
Pre-sentence treatment options?
Yeah, like ASAP is a program that for people who are
ASAP
alcohol.
is typically a condition of sentence.
Conviction. It's still a good question, but it's typically post-conviction, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And you go in and you say, you know, be screened, if they say classes, if they say outpatient, if they say residential, we require them to do that, and we put a cap on the amount of residential time, because it's, you know, it's locked up, essentially. But that's post-conviction.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well, and that was part of our recommendation that the legislature did fix on allowing ASAP. It had restricted it to just OUIs, and it in 54 expanded it out, so alcohol-related
Other-
crimes can be. Yeah.
Okay.
What you really need is 4 treatment facilities, outpatient, inpatient, different flavors of treatment, because not everybody responds to the same thing. Make it easier to get assessments of people in jail. I've got people in my PACE board who say, Judge, I need help. And so I go, okay, can I get them assessed in jail? And currently, it's extraordinarily difficult to get somebody assessed in jail. So now I gotta let this guy out to get assessed. And I know it's gonna happen. The guy's an addict. He's gonna use in the next 36 hours. It takes a while to get him to get the appointment, and then he's gotta cross your fingers and say sober or straight until he gets the assessment. They say you need residential. I gotta find him a bed space. If you can figure out a way to get assessments in the jail more quickly and have more treatment facilities, right now you're putting people in the most expensive bed we have.
I really liked your point from the Hawaii experiment. There are a number of good points, but it's the rapidity, not the extent of the punishment and consequence that makes it.
Up to a point, but yes.
One of the concerns I've heard raised on the bail schedule is when you arrest somebody for a crime that they did and then release them OR regularly, they see that same consequence of there's no consequence. I go in, I go out, and I can go back and do this. I could do this again and I'll be released to OR. So don't we break that consequence chain that is so important in
I
the
don't
example?
doubt that there are a category of people who come to that conclusion because for them, they have a short, they're thinking about the release decision as the end of the matter and aren't thinking about that actually you're going to be on trial or change of plea or sentenced 2 or 3 or 4 months later. If you could shrink, magically the end result time so that the arrest and the resolution are quicker, you would eliminate some of that. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah. We have to move on. Really appreciate it. Thank you. It's part of our learning about this issue that you've lived with. So you're welcome to stay, but we'll move on to APD. Any last comments you want to say?
I've got people waiting for me.
Okay, good. You can have the last word, though.
No.
I think you did anyway, but you could have the second last word, right?
I think he generally does.
Right.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for being willing to ask questions and be educated.
To turn to APD and get Chief Dahl, he's got a presentation. But first, I've been getting a lot of questions about Proposition 1. I sent you on Monday some of those questions. I didn't want to surprise you with them, but I just wanted to ask so I can respond to people. Our non-discrimination ordinance was passed a couple of years ago. Allows people to use the restroom of their gender identity. Has APD seen any public safety problems as a result of that change?
We don't really track crime in that manner. I think if there's a reported crime occurring in a bathroom or really anywhere else, APD responds to all of those, like we said many times. I don't think there's a specific spike in some kind of bathroom-related call for service, but that's not something that we specifically track.
You haven't seen that.
Nor do I really have a feeling that that's an issue.
Under current law, is it a crime for someone to enter a restroom with the intent to harass somebody?
Yeah, there are a whole host of crimes, obviously, that apply to that. Things like harassment or assault. There are a variety of things. Again, APD responds to all those calls for reports of crime. Each situation is a little different, but calls are prioritized and responded to accordingly. And typically, in-progress crimes and violent person crimes are things that we respond to immediately or as quickly as we can.
So you likely would have heard about them if it was. Did you guys request Proposition 1?
Did APD?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of.
Does it address compelling public concerns that you have?
I haven't actually read it, but my understanding of it is that it's not something that APD is especially concerned about. There are a host of public safety concerns right now that APD is working on. Violent street crime, especially property crime, and this isn't something that's on our horizon for any kind of special enforcement.
Yeah, Mr. Dunbar.
Well, I'm curious about the other kind of enforcement. If Proposition 1 were to pass, and people could be denied entry into a bathroom, say in Dinah Center, because they can't prove their sex or with a birth certificate or whatever form of ID is required, how would APD enforce that?
I honestly don't know how we would enforce something like that. But again, I haven't read the specific provisions that are proposed there. But that would be something that would be extraordinarily difficult for us to deal with.
I say you've got to show me your birth certificate. You say no, and we both call APD. How do they respond?
Every single case is going to be just a little bit different, and the responding officers are going to have to evaluate everything they're being told and everything they see and try to come up with something. But I think that part of that kind of goes back to what we typically tell people when they're intervening in crimes, which is if you don't know exactly what you're doing and you take some kind of action, you could actually end up being the subject of the investigation. So, anytime somebody wants to take some kind of proactive step to enforce a law, we would always prefer they call us and let us do it.
Except in this case, you are not totally sure how you would enforce it.
I don't know how we would enforce that. That would be difficult. Depends on how it eventually gets written or what.
His presentation is coming up. Any other questions on this? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So do you envision it as a rational use of police power to actually check people's identification at the bathroom door?
Well, I can tell you that I don't think that APD currently has the capacity to have bathroom staffed with police officers for checking ID. I mean, it's hard to say that with a straight face, but I don't have any idea. We have so many other priorities that I can't ever see us doing something like that, some kind of special enforcement at that level.
Thank you.
Ready to go to his presentation? Sorry that.
One more.
Okay, yeah, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I'm sort of stuck on this enforcement mechanism here. So if APD doesn't imagine itself being able to enforce this or having the staffing capacity to enforce this or even wanting to enforce it, and civilians take it upon themselves to decide to enforce this, do you imagine scenarios where Proposition 1, in the end, the proponents say this is going to make Anchorage safer. From your perspective, is that the case that's going to happen here or not?
I don't really think I can say it would make Anchorage safe or unsafe, but I don't think it's really going to affect the way APD responds to reports of criminal activity. If somebody reports a crime, we're going to show up and we're going to evaluate it and do the best we can to make a determination if criminal activity is occurring or whatever the legal framework is.
Thank you.
I'd like to go to the report. Following up on Judge Morris's, if you guys, between the two of you, between the prosecutors and the police, can give me some idea of how many of your people in a month, whatever period of time, Officer Case or Ms. Thino, have bail set pursuant to the schedule or by a magistrate. Whatever unit of time you can do it, I'd appreciate it. Chief Dahl.
I had originally intended to go through kind of slide by slide like we normally do. Do we still have time for that, or do you want me to just answer questions? We handed it out to everyone, I'm happy to do either.
Maybe we could do a little both. Can we skip to stolen cars and drunk drivings?
Okay.
And that's starting on slide 6 or 7.
6 or 7, the ID, EU.
Well, before we get there, you pointed out to me just before the meeting, you can see on the arrests, right, the impact of new officers from last year. per month, we're ahead of, well, particularly as we hit July, August, September, October, when those new officers are coming on, it's substantially over last year.
Correct. You start to see sort of a trend there in the middle of the year where we start to have effectively more arrests per month than we did in 2016. And I think that's something we've talked about in front of the Assembly previously, where it's not surprising that with more officers on the street, we're seeing a higher level of activity.
When did those officers come online, if you will? Was it, because April I see the first kind of big bump. Is that when some came? Or is that?
There probably were some, I'm trying to remember back what our schedule was. There probably were some that were released from training in the spring. And then we just had kind of this fall another round. It happens roughly every 6 months. There's some flexibility in the training schedule. So.
Great, okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering, Chief Dahl, I was just looking at the arrests, difference between October and November, between 2016 and 2017. It's like 300, it dropped like 300 arrests in November versus October. Any idea why that is?
Are you looking at, so in October of 2016, there were 786 arrests, and in 17, there were 1,031. Is that the particular?
Yeah, and then, and then the next month in November, it goes from 1,031 to 735.
So at the very bottom there, in difficult to read print, it says that the data for November isn't complete.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get that far down.
This is something that almost every time we put numbers out, we have to kind of remind ourselves and everybody else. A lot of times, some of the last month is typically not complete. Just
Okay.
there's a delay from when the reports come in and then they're classified and go through the records keeping system. So I apologize for that, but we usually have a little disclaimer on whatever the last month is that it's not complete.
Okay, all right, sorry about that.
No, that's
My
great.
apologies for it being unclear.
And then you've made, and you've told us about that, stolen vehicles, somewhat of a concentration, as well as drunk driving enforcement. Maybe you could give us an update sort of with these slides of how that's going.
Sure. So if you look at the IDEU grant year-end stats, it just talks about the grant-funded units that we have. It's 6 officers and 1 supervisor, and their only mission is by enforcement. And they work from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and they work over the weekends and so forth. So you can see they had a year where they were fairly busy. They're handle about half of all the DUI arrests that the department makes. And just there's some summary information there about their activity, but they've been fairly busy. The next slide talks about OUI arrests, and just generally, this year and last year, they've been a little bit below kind of the running 5-year average. There could be a number of reasons for that. Typically, when we look at something like this, one of the things that we ask is, well, is it due to lack of adequate effort by the police department? But I think with additional officers assigned to patrol and the fact that we have a unit that is dedicated, and that's all they do is OUI enforcement. I don't feel like that's the case. I would probably want to look at this in conjunction with the number of fatality traffic collisions we've had that involve OUI, but generally I think that the enforcement may be having an effect, and that might be why we're seeing lower numbers.
Well, and the numbers, I mean, the October kind of stands out and biases it, but up to that, summer numbers, we were higher this year than last, and others very close. Do you have a cumulative on that, Officer Case? Because it might be that cumulatively we're on track or higher.
I don't know if we have a cumulative.
Not today, I don't.
Yeah, okay. Well, we can look at it again at the end of the year, because by the end of the year, you'll have all those on and we'll get a better
My
fix.
impression would be that you're seeing 17 a little higher because we had the OUI unit in effect,
Right.
so we had a little bit more enforcement effort.
Yeah, did you want, Mr.
I was
Dunbar?
going to say that whether it's true or not, Uber and Lyft would argue that they are appreciably reducing the number of DUIs in the city. I don't know if that's true or not.
It would be interesting to see if you could formulate a way to see if that really if there is an effect there.
And then,
So stolen vehicles continue to be higher than the 5-year average.
This is the amount of reports of stolen vehicles, not
Correct.
arrests here.
Correct.
And on the next slide, the thefts have gone up 57% and your arrests have increased 73%. So we're maybe starting to get our head above water on sort of that issue that came at us.
There's, as we've discussed previously multiple times, there's some things the department's trying to do to kind of get a handle on this type of criminal activity. But I think also too, having more officers in patrol makes a difference. I mean, patrol is typically where we have our stolen vehicle recoveries happen, right? Officers out driving around, they see vehicles that they check and find are stolen or that they know are stolen, and then they make an attempt at an apprehension. And so we are seeing an increase in the number of arrests that we're making for that, and I think that that's a good thing.
On my ride along, I saw him doing that a lot. The officer, like, if it looks suspicious, we just run that plate, run that.
And if you look back over the last couple of years, our trend is pretty consistent. We recovered the vast majority of vehicles that are stolen. And then the next slide after that talks about damage to the vehicles. And, I don't have included in here specific data on sort of the length of time it takes for us to recover them, but my sense is, and when we've looked at that in the past, it's usually still just a little bit over a week is kind of the average. But all the vehicles that were stolen so far this year, you can see that about 2,300 were recovered with $0 damage reported, so the vast majority. And then it kind of gives a breakdown in the dollar amount, but for the most part, that, and the two slides back talks about that. Still, the average is about $200 in damage, but the vast majority had none.
I appreciate that. Officer Case and I were, and Ms. Morse were working on, because I'd had that number of the average being 200 or 219, and so it seemed to me likely that a lot were recovered at $0, and that number helps bring it out. So what are people doing if they're not taking the car to break it down to parts? What are they doing with it?
Well, I think that's a good question. I don't know for a fact what people are doing with them, but my impression from talking to patrol officers is that typically they're taking them, they're driving them around for a while, and they're committing other criminal activity with it. So, we're happy that so many of them get recovered without any damage, but obviously we just prefer they didn't get stolen in the first place. So, especially as we're working our way into winter, we always want to remind folks, don't leave your vehicle running with the keys in it unlocked. I just heard yesterday I was driving, I think, from this building back to the police station, and I heard a vehicle report come out where somebody had stopped at a gas station and had left the vehicle running just for a second with the keys in the car and unlocked, and it was stolen. So, help us help you by not doing that.
Not making it so easy?
Yeah, and then, and like I said, we are putting a lot of effort in both detectives and like the investigative support unit and other places into trying to find people that are frequently engaged in this activity and interdict them. So.
Did you have a question?
No, I had a comment once the presentation was done. I thought that was the last slide.
It looks like it is. Yeah, Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the chief and the department for their response last night. There was a rather large incident in my neighborhood with the SWAT team was called out, and they cordoned off a large area, and they were able to, I believe, I don't know all the details yet, but it appears that they resolved the situation with no fatalities and no injuries to officers. So I just want to commend you, and everyone in my neighborhood that was kind of standing around on the edges seemed to be in good spirits and appreciate the work you did. So just thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I appreciate that. And just a little bit of detail is that essentially there's a disturbed person there that was that may have been firing off gunshots, but the SWAT team arrived, and also we have a bunch of really highly trained negotiators, and they were able to resolve it with no injury to the suspect or any officer. So.
Can we send them to Juneau?
I was just going to say that. All right. So we have a tight amount of time. Appreciate your report. Ms. Thino, I see Mr. Rod in the back. Just a brief summary of what you're trying to do on.
Amy had her hand up
Oh, did
for a
you?
while.
I'm sorry. Good.
It's all right. People often don't see me.
They hear you though.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, I have a couple of questions. One is about community patrols, and the second is about community engagement with APD and trying to work with some of these newer community patrols or even older ones. What is your strategy going into 2018 as far as trying to be communicating with those community patrols and whatnot?
We've had a lot of success in the past working with community patrols and also from time to time some issues as well. But I think that we have some officers that are assigned to the CAP team that are really good at providing that interface. We're always willing to come out if a new community patrol is forming and give them kind of some guidelines and some things that they can do as far as, and also some education on interfacing with officers if they end up, on community patrol and, reporting criminal activity. So I think that strategy's been pretty effective in the past. We're going to continue doing that. And if you know of anybody that's thinking of forming a patrol, please have them reach out to us, and we'll have the CAP team talk to them.
Well, and one thing I'm sure you know, but Eagle River is forming a new community patrol. But I've had Cliff going to the Anchorage Coalition meetings, and he's done a ride along with APD because, again, we don't want vigilantism, but we want clear communication and people to understand, this is what we expect of you, and this is how you interface with APD. So I know from the Birchwood Community Patrol's perspective, the CAP team is amazing, and the communication's fantastic. But I didn't know, as your strategy, working with the community patrols, the community councils, I think in my district, the community patrols and the councils are pretty much interfaced. So I don't know that we need it necessarily an APD cop at every community council meeting. But, Eagle River has clamored for a long time to have consistency in our patrol officers that are out there. And I think that will help with that community conversation.
That's something we want too, is consistency in patrol areas, and something we're working towards. Besides just the logistical issues of having enough officers to make that happen, there are a bunch of sort of behind the scenes things that happen. It's some things as simple as just creating schedules for patrol to work off of that we're trying to work our way through to make that happen. But it is something that's a priority for me personally, and I want it to be a priority for the department too.
Very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else from anyone else of Chief Dahl? Any other assembly members? Ms. Thino, then apologize that got compressed, but just briefly an update on community work service.
With regards to,
Well, getting enough for, I thought you and Mr. Rada had been working on ways to get more community work service to him. If not, we can update on a later time.
Over the years, the criminal laws have changed such that community work service has been less and less utilized as part of sentencing. So it used to be that we had multiple charges that required mandatory community work service in the sentence, which kept community work service well endowed with folks that they could send out to clean homeless camps or do anything else. But the numbers have been dwindling significantly because those laws have changed. So as part of the homeless committee group's attempt to target clean up the homeless camps, our office agreed that we would increase our usage of community work service as a sentencing component when appropriate. And hopefully that will swell the ranks of community work service so that they have folks that they can send out and be more productive there. In addition, SB 54 reinstituted mandatory community work service for some property offenses. So when we adjust our code to mirror, then we will probably go to that as well. It's not required, but we might go there to have it mandatory. So there are multiple ways that we're reinstituting community work service to try and increase the ranks to get those folks out there on the street making a difference in Anchorage.
Fabulous. Okay, and we'll as that develops more, we'll have you present more about it. And then the final thing was a 3-minute presentation. Albert, are you ready? Are you able? Okay, why don't you do that? On Nextdoor, many of you are familiar with it. Albert was a very early adopter of Nextdoor, sort of nationally even,
That's right here.
and asked to present on that issue.
Jack and Case can probably help you with that.
While he's setting up, was there anyone here who came in order to testify? This was more about the things that you saw here. But am I missing anyone that really wanted to tell us something? Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that the chairman of the Public Safety Committee or Commission is here, McDanger.
Still a great name.
Thank you, Amy. Am I up?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me start with this. I recorded this so I can get within 100 milliseconds.
sorry, but I do not represent any of the firms or organizations that I may mention in this presentation. Some of you may know me because of the friends I used to have. This young lady and I used to walk the neighborhood in South Edition quite frequently. After some encounters about her safety and discussion with the police, I realized I really did not know my neighbors very well.
Looking for a way to connect with your neighbors? Well, there's an app for that.
I found one at nextdoor.com. It seemed to be exactly what I was looking for, so I set it up for South Edition. And as I was the first one to set it up, I matched our community council boundaries, and that decision has impacted Anchorage today, which we can discuss later if you like. Today, South Edition Nextdoor has 38% of the residents belong to Nextdoor. That's over 1,200 confirmed residents of South Edition. Citywide, there's over 34,000 members. This map is as of a month ago. It's changed quite a bit since then. This graph shows how it's really growing. It's growing at 5% per month, over 34,000 members. Now, as of 1st of December, 23% of the households in Anchorage belong to Nextdoor now. I realized it was created on the idea that the neighborhood is one of the most important and useful communities in a person's life, and they designed their application that way. Nextdoor is designed for meeting your neighbors. There's a part of Nextdoor that you may not be aware of called Nextdoor.agency. It's different than your Nextdoor. Over 3,000 public agencies in the lower 48 use it today. How is it used, this agency thing? Some of the things it's used for: law enforcement activity. The mayor's offices send things out. Public Works uses it to post things about their activities. Emergency management does planning and suggestions for you. Neighborhood services occur, and we could very effectively use it for community council communications. What occurred to me, can this be used to stop crime before the crime is committed? Like other police chiefs are saying about Nextdoor. Chief Brown, Dallas, Texas says, Nextdoor makes it easy for neighbors to establish their own virtual neighborhood watches, which are vital in combating crime and strengthening communities. Chief of Police San Jose, California say, we know that connected and engaged neighbors lead to safer communities. Nextdoor is another way our police departments and our community can use technology to stay informed and reduce crime to increase awareness. What does our own Chief Dahl say? Well,
I really encourage people, get to know the people that live around you. Learn who your neighbors are. Talk to your neighbors.
You look
about
good,
what you're
Chief.
seeing. That kind of sharing of information, and then ultimately sharing it with the police department, that's what keeps the community safe.
I still think
Over
that's a good idea.
34,000 residents, Anchorage belong to Nextdoor.com. This is a huge untapped resource. Can we use it like the police chiefs are saying? If you believe neighbors knowing neighbors build safer neighborhoods, I really encourage you to instruct the administration to use Nextdoor.com agency in an effective manner with the objective of helping neighbors meet neighbors, helping neighbors work together to build safer neighborhoods. Let us help you stop the crime before the crime. In closing, I'd like to thank you for your attention and a thanks to Channel 11 for the use of their clip. Even if your neighbor is different, they can still be your friend.
Yay, star. All right, we're at 12:30. Thank you, Albert.
Wait, more.
Chief Dahl, there's a section in there, I cut this down to get down to the limitation of time. I implied that you endorsed Nextdoor, but the other people didn't. I wanted to do. I didn't intend to do that.
I appreciate that.
You don't endorse it?
Not yet, but I'm looking.
I'm going to adjourn out from under all of you. So this meeting's adjourned. I think.